1944, every new tail gunner in the 8th Air Force learned one number before he learned his crew's names: 38%. That was the casualty rate for his position, not for the plane, not for the squadron, for the man in the very back of the bomber, alone with 2 machine guns and everyone else's fate. Out of every 100 men who crouched behind the twin 50 caliber guns in a B-17 tail, 38 would not finish their tour. They would be killed in action, missing in action, or so badly wounded they would never fly again. On paper, the number lived in quiet reports, casualty tables, charts on briefing room walls that most crews never saw. In practice, it lived in the way veterans glanced at an empty tail position when a new man climbed aboard, in how ground crew checked that turret one more time, in how nobody made future plans with the first tail gunner in a crew until he had at least 5 missions behind him. The tail position on a B-17 looked simple. 2 50 caliber Browning machine guns mounted in a cramped metal shell, a small, thick glass window, a seat that barely deserved the name. To get there, you crawled along the fuselage past the radio room, past the waist gunners, down a narrowing tunnel with the floor vibrating under your knees. You reached the end of the airplane and dropped into a space just big enough for your shoulders and your boots. Behind you there was nothing. No armor plate, no bulkhead, just aluminum skin and air. From there, you saw the war in one direction only. Everything that could kill the bomber came at you from behind. Fighters diving from 6 o'clock high with cannons firing. Fighters sliding up from 6 o'clock low, trying to get under your guns. Fighters from 5:30 or 7:30, just far enough off the direct line that waist gunners had to coordinate with you or leave gaps. If they misjudged the angle, the fighter went through the blind spot and took a long, accurate shot at your tail. The doctrine you got in gunnery school was straightforward. Defensive fire. Wait until the enemy committed to his attack run. Never open up at extreme range. Conserve ammunition. Use short bursts. Focus on the most immediate threat. Trust formation fire to handle the rest. The instructors wrote ranges on chalkboards: 2,000 yards, 1,500, 1,000, 800. Maximum range, effective range, ideal range. They drilled the phrase low probability of hit into you until it sounded like a law of physics. What they could not show you in a classroom was what those numbers felt like when the sky behind your bomber started to fill with dots. A normal mission briefing for a bomber crew began with target, factory, rail yard, oil plant, then flak, light, medium, heavy, then fighters. How many? What type? From which direction they were likely to come. Tail gunners listened hardest when the intelligence officer talked about tactics. 4, ship rudder. 6, ship flight. Echelon from stern, quarter high. Standard approach patterns. You could see the diagrams printed in every German fighter manual without ever having read one. A fighter pilot saw your bomber as a geometry problem: closing speed, angle of approach, time in the kill zone. He trained for it. He rehearsed it in formation with his squadron. He knew that gunners would open fire when the lead fighter reached a predictable range. He also knew they would almost always track the aircraft that looked most dangerous. The one flying directly behind the bomber. The one diving fastest. That fighter acted as bait. The wingman used the distraction to slide into a better firing line. All of that assumed one thing: that you, the gunner, would react, that you would wait for the enemy to dictate when the engagement began. Everything in the training pipeline was built on that assumption. The attacker chooses the time, the defender accepts it. When Staff Sergeant Michael Donovan first sat in a tail turret, he already knew he did not like those odds. He had grown up in South Boston, where fights were not abstract. By 17, he had been in more than 30 of them. On the street, The man who waited for a punch to land before he hit back usually did not get a second chance. Whoever threw first had the advantage, not because he was stronger, but because he forced the other man to react to him, to cover up, to flinch, to think about defense instead of attack. The Air Forces did not care about his philosophy. They almost did not care about him at all. When he enlisted after Pearl Harbor, the processing clerk saw his build and suggested ground crew. Donovan insisted on gunnery. He wanted to be where the fight was, not where the paperwork was. At gunnery school, that attitude set him apart. Instructors said he was too aggressive, too willing to expose himself, too eager to fire early. He kept asking one question. What good is a gun you are told not to shoot until they are already killing you? The answer he got was always the same. Ammunition is limited. You have 2,000 rounds in the tail. At 1,200 rounds per minute, you can empty both guns in less than a minute of continuous fire. If you waste that on low probability shots, you will be dry when the real attack comes. Better to wait. Better to make each burst count. He did not argue with the arithmetic. He liked arithmetic. It was honest. 2,000 rounds, 30 rounds per burst, 60, 70 bursts for the whole mission. Look at how many fighters you might face. Look at how many attacks they might make. Spread your fire. Plan ahead. What he questioned was the way everyone treated the enemy's decision as fixed. German fighters will attack. They will get into ideal range. They will fire. You cannot stop that part. All you can do is reduce the damage once they are already shooting. On his first mission, he saw what that looked like in reality. The target was a ball-bearing factory at Schweinfurt. German fighters came in from 6 o'clock high, just like the diagrams. The tail gunner he was replacing, a man with more missions than Donovan had weeks in theater, did everything textbook. Waited. Called out range and angle. Opened up at 800 yards. Short bursts. Controlled corrections. He still watched two B-17s in the formation take fatal hits from cannon shells that came in before his tracers walked onto the enemy fighter's nose. Back on the ground, Donovan noticed something. Everyone praised the tail gunner for his discipline, for not firing too soon, for not wasting ammunition. They shrugged at the bombers that did not come back. That was the enemy's doing. That was unavoidable. In the barracks that night, Donovan sat with a scrap of paper and rebuilt the engagement as he understood it. German fighters forming up 2,000 yards behind. Time to attack run. Time they spent straight and level, aligning. Time they were visible in his sights, but outside the range, instructors approved. He estimated that a 1-second burst at that distance meant maybe 20 rounds in the air. Low chance of a hit, but if even one German pilot broke off early, changed his angle, disrupted his wingman's shot, that was one cannon run that did not happen as planned. He compared that to what a successful attack cost them. 1 bomber lost, 10 men, 50,000 pounds of aircraft, thousands of gallons of fuel, and weeks of maintenance hours invested. His math did not care about tradition. It cared about trade-offs. What gunnery school called waste started looking to him like insurance. The problem was not just arithmetic. It was psychology. Training had drilled fear of waste into the gunners. Do not shoot too early. Do not expose your position. Let the enemy come to you. The same training had taught German pilots the opposite lesson. Attack aggressively, close to ideal distance. Trust that the gunners would obey their own rules. For 2 years over Europe, that pattern held. Fighters dictated the rhythm. Bombers endured it. By the time Donovan reached the 390th Bombardment Group at Framlingham, the tail gunner's reputation was so bad that crews spoke of the position as cursed. The man whose spot he took had survived a near-catastrophic encounter and immediately asked for reassignment. He told the crew chief that the next tail gunner would die there. It sounded like superstition. The casualty tables backed him up. The pilot of Hell's Fury, Captain James Whitmore, did not sugarcoat it when he interviewed Donovan. He asked if the new man knew the statistics. Donovan answered with the same numbers the pilot had in his own folder. 38%, highest in the airplane. Whitmore told him that on most missions, the tail gunner was the first to see the enemy and the last to have any real friends nearby if things went wrong. Out there, he said, you are the back wall between us and everyone who wants to kill us. Donovan's answer was blunt. Better to be on the wall with the guns than in front of it without them. What set him apart was not that he was braver than other gunners. Everyone who climbed into a tail turret with those odds accepted more risk than most people would in a lifetime. What set him apart was that he refused to accept the premise that his job was purely reactive. He looked at the same geometry, the same ranges, the same ammunition count, and saw a different problem. The question was not how long can you survive being hunted. The question was whether you could make the hunters change how they hunted in the first place. The first time Donovan tried his idea in the air, nobody had given him permission. It was March 2nd, 1944. Target, a ball-bearing plant at Schweinfurt. Altitude, 24,000 feet. Airspeed, 180 knots. Outside air temperature, 40 degrees below zero. Inside the tail turret of Hell's Fury, the only warmth came from 2 hot gun barrels and the blood in his hands. They were halfway to the target when the call came over intercom. Fighters, 6 o'clock high. 12 bandits. The voice belonged to the top turret gunner who had the best overall view. Donovan swung his twin 50s up and aft. At first, he saw nothing but empty sky. Then his eyes picked out the dots. At 2,000 yards, 12 Messerschmitt Bf 109s looked like a row of black insects, almost harmless. They were in a standard climb formation, closing slowly, aligning their spacing and altitude. Everything he had been taught said the same thing. Wait, let them come. Track the lead ship. Ignore the rest until they commit. Open fire at 800 yards. Short bursts only. Conserve ammunition. He watched the formation adjusting like a machine. Lead fighter slightly higher, the others stepping down off each wing. He imagined their cockpit briefings. Approach from 6 high. Come in fast. Take advantage of the tail gunner's blind cone under the bomber. Draw his fire with 1 aircraft. Slide the wingman into the real firing line while the American focuses on the obvious threat. His hands rested on the handles, thumbs off the triggers. Training told him that any rounds fired now would be waste. Low probability of hit. The gunnery school instructor's voice in his head said it clearly. Those are bullets you will want back later. He also saw something the numbers on the chalkboard had not shown. While those 12 fighters formed up, they were stable, straight and level, predictable. For 20 or 30 seconds, every pilot's attention was on maintaining perfect spacing with his leader, not on dodging. In those seconds, their formation was not a weapon. It was a target. He ran his own math. A 1-second burst from both guns meant about 40 rounds per gun, 80 rounds total. At 2,000 yards, maybe 1 bullet in 100 would be on a path that could hit anything important. If he was unlucky, he got nothing but smoke trails and empty air. If he was lucky, he might clip a wing, hit a coolant line, or just scare someone into jerking the stick at the wrong moment. A single broken German attack could save 10 men and 50,000 pounds of aircraft. 80 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition weighed about 7 kilograms. 10 men weighed nearly a ton. Even a crude scale made the exchange look reasonable. He felt the fighter formation slide through the 2,000-yard mark. Still no command to fire from the pilot. No one expected him to do anything yet. That was the point. Donovan squeezed the triggers. The twin Brownings erupted, traces stretching backward into space like white ropes. The sound in his tiny metal shell was a flat, continuous roar, more vibration than noise. The first rounds went wild, of course. The fighters were small, the distance long. But they were not the only audience he was firing for. The men in those Messerschmitts saw something they had not planned on. A tail position that lit up long before any of them were in textbook range. The effect was immediate. The German leader broke out of his steady approach into a defensive jink, banking right and rolling slightly. Two wingmen followed on reflex. The carefully built geometry of the attack dissolved into individual reactions. A few seconds later, the entire line of black dots broke its smooth line into a messy swarm. On the intercom, Captain Whitmore's voice snapped through. "Tail, cease fire. You are wasting ammunition." Donovan lifted his thumbs, but kept watching. The BF-109s did not resume their original pattern. When they came back, their angle was shallower, their spacing uneven. They were probing now, not charging. That caution meant time. Time for the formation's other gunners to track them. Time for the bombers to adjust slightly. Time for mistakes. Whitmore spoke again, calmer. "Tail, explain." Donovan kept his eyes on the regrouping fighters. "Sir, that burst cost us maybe 80 rounds. That is 4 seconds of fire. If it kept one of them from doing a clean pass at 800 yards, that is 8 cannon shells that never got accurate." He did not argue further. He did not have to. The next attack run gave him proof. 6 BF-109s came in from 6 o'clock high. Standard. 1 lead. 2 tucked on each wing. 1 slightly low. Every gunnery manual said to engage the lead aircraft. It was the closest. It looked the most dangerous. It drew the eye whether you wanted it to or not. Donovan ignored it. He knew from the training diagrams that the wingman on the right, the second man in line, would be flying a flatter, more predictable trajectory. His job in that formation was to hold position, not improvise. He would be looking at the bomber, at his lead, at his gun sight, not at the rear turret. Range, 1,200 yards, 1,100. The lead fighter was still adjusting, nose wagging slightly. The wingman was a straight, smooth line. Donovan shifted his sights, locked them onto the second fighter, and held his fire as they closed. At 1,000 yards, most gunners would have started short bursts. At 900, they would have been in full defensive mode, tracking the lead, trying to time their fire for maximum effect. He waited to 800, 700. At 600, his sights filled with the profile of the second Messerschmitt. No zigzag, no jink. He squeezed and held for a full 2 seconds. 160 rounds went out in that short space of time. 50 caliber tracers walked up the length of the BF-109 from the radiator under the nose to the root of the right wing. At that range, the difference between a near miss and a catastrophic hit was measured in centimeters. He watched the German fighter simply come apart. The engine cowling burst open. Flames swallowed the canopy. Pieces separated and tumbled. The lead fighter, suddenly alone in his lane, broke off hard left without firing a shot. The rest of the attack peeled away in confusion. Back on the ground, the crew chief counted the empty links in Donovan's ammunition cans. 1,600 rounds expended, 80% of his load. Standard doctrine said that was reckless. Too much fire for too little time in combat. Donovan thought about the mission as a whole. Hell's Fury had come home without a single cannon round punching through her fuselage. No dead men on stretchers. No engines holed. No control cables severed. He could not prove that his early fire had prevented that damage, but he knew this. The German fighters had never been allowed a clean, rehearsed attack run. In the barracks that night, He took out that same scrap of paper and wrote new numbers. 2,000 rounds total, 1,600 used, 400 remaining. 12 fighters in the first group, 6 in the second. How many complete attack patterns had he seen before his burst scattered them? 0. He compared that to the cost of following the book. Fire only at 800 yards, short bursts, conserve 70% of your ammunition. Watch 2 or 3 planes in your box explode under precise cannon fire from pilots who never had to dodge you. The next day, he went to the intelligence section and asked to see whatever material they had on German fighter tactics. He read the descriptions of stern quarter approaches, the idea of the lead aircraft acting as a shield, the expectation that American gunners would behave predictably. All of it depended on one ingredient: the tail guns firing when the fighters said the fight began. He realized that his real weapon was not just steel and gunpowder, it was uncertainty. If he could convince a German Staffel that any time they lined up neatly, there was a good chance those rear guns would lash out early, they would stop lining up neatly. They would start improvising. Pilots who improvised under fire made mistakes. Mistakes created gaps. Gaps gave his crew breathing room. Aggression, in his mind, was not about bravado. It was about moving the engagement from the part of the graph where the enemy had rehearsed every move into the part where he was guessing. On March 4th, they gave him another chance to test that theory. Different target. Another factory somewhere on a map of Germany none of the crew had ever seen in peacetime. Same altitude, same cold, same grind of engine noise through the airframe. Again, the call came. Fighters, 6 high, forming up. This time, Captain Whitmore said nothing on the intercom. Donovan saw the Messerschmitts line up. He did not wait for anyone's permission. He opened up at long range. Shorter bursts now, 1 second at a time, 20 rounds per gun, 40 out into the sky. Enough traces to let the enemy know that this tail was not asleep and not interested in playing by their rules. The formation wobbled, not as badly as the first time. These pilots were either more experienced or they had already heard stories about bombers with crazy gunners, but even a little hesitation turned a drilled pattern into a loose one. When they finally committed to the run, coming in from 6 high, he repeated the logic that had worked at Schweinfurt. He let the lead fighter play his role, watched him soak up the attention and the return fire. Then he put his sights on the wingman, the man whose job was to stay steady. He killed that man first. Up in the cockpit, the pilot saw something he had never seen before. A whole group of German fighters breaking off because the second aircraft in their element had exploded before the lead even fired. On the intercom, he said what everyone in the crew was thinking. "What the hell are you doing back there?" Donovan answered, with numbers rather than words. "Sir, I used 20 rounds at long range to keep 12 men from flying the pattern they practiced. Then I used 200 to erase the one who thought I would ignore him. We are still here. They are not. It was the start of a pattern. He was still, technically, a defensive gunner. He was still in the most dangerous seat on the airplane. But somewhere between the chalkboard ranges he had been taught and the traces he was now putting into the sky, the role was beginning to bend. He was not just bracing to absorb what came. He was probing to see where the other side would flinch first. March 6th, 1944. 23,000 feet over Germany. Hell's fury sits in a long, ragged line of B-17s pushing toward Augsburg. 800 bombers total in the wider stream. Heavy flak ahead. Expected fighter opposition. 2,500 aircraft over the course of the day. On paper, Donovan is one tail gunner in one airplane. In practice, the way he handles the next few minutes will decide whether his crew ever sees England again. Weather is clear. Visibility is good. That helps both sides. It means German fighters can see the bomber formation from miles away. It also means gunners in the bombers can see the fighters forming up long before they commit. In hell's fury, everyone knows this mission is going to be worse than the factory runs before. The briefing said so. Augsburg is deep. The target is valuable. That draws the best pilots and the most determined resistance. Captain Whitmore gathers his crew before takeoff and says the usual things. Stay sharp. Call out what you see. Trust your positions. Then Donovan asks for something extra. He tells Whitmore he wants to be allowed to fire aggressively before attack runs fully develop. Not just occasional long-range bursts, a sustained effort to disrupt formations whenever they start to build. Whitmore does not like the idea of burning ammunition before the real fight, but he has seen what Donovan's experiments did to earlier attacks. 2 missions. No hits on their bomber. No clean German passes. He is not blind to the pattern. He gives Donovan one condition. You have 1 mission to prove this is worth the risk. If we get carved up, you go back to schoolhouse doctrine. Donovan accepts. For him, this is not about being right. It is about testing a hypothesis at scale. What happens if you treat the tail guns as an offensive weapon against enemy coordination, not just as defense against individual fighters? They take off at dawn, climb over East Anglia, form up, cross the channel. The first hour over enemy territory is almost routine. Flak at a distance, no fighters close. Then, at 9:19, the call comes over intercom. Fighters, 6 o'clock high, 12 of them. Donovan rotates the tail turret. The bandits are exactly where he expects to see them, 2,000 yards out, slightly above the bomber stream. 12 BF-109s in a disciplined line, starting to fan out into a wave. It is a pattern that has killed hundreds of crews over the last 2 years. Standard response would be to watch them get closer, call out their position, let the formation as a whole prepare to fire the moment the lead fighter begins his dive. Conserve ammunition until then, accept their timing. Donovan has a different clock in his head. It says, these 12 fighters are at their most vulnerable now, during the approach and formation phase. Their paths are still predictable. Their attention is divided between holding position and reading cues from their leader. He starts firing at 2,000 yards. The first burst is long for that distance, 2 seconds, about 300 rounds total. Traces streak across the empty space. Most of them will never touch metal, but they are not truly wasted. They force the German pilots to accept a fact they did not plan for. This bomber's tail is already hostile. The leader snaps his BF-109 into an abrupt roll and brake. 2 wingmen flinch with him. The neat formation crumples. Fighters that were lining up for a classic coordinated attack now have to look after themselves. On the intercom, Whitmore orders Donovan to cease fire. From his perspective in the cockpit, he sees bright tracer lines arcing long before anything is in textbook range. Years of training call that waste. Donovan lifts his thumbs briefly and answers with a simple statement. Sir, they are not attacking. They are defending. True enough. The fighters that reform do so with more hesitation. They slide in closer, but not as a tight phalanx. Angles are off. Timing is uneven. They are probing, not executing a script. When they finally commit, coming from 6 o'clock high again, they split into 2 elements. 6 directly astern, 6 slightly off to 7 o'clock. The standard doctrine in most B-17s would be to try to engage both groups, swinging the tail guns back and forth and hoping waist gunners fill the gaps. Donovan does not try to do everything. He assigns the threat. Waist, you own 7 o'clock. 6 is mine. That is more than bravado. It is application of his focus principle. You cannot effectively engage multiple sectors with one gun position when you are heavily outnumbered. Better to make one direction so dangerous that the enemy abandons it, while trusting your crew to handle the others. He locks his sights on the lead fighter in the 6 o'clock group and opens fire at 1,200 yards. Short, punching bursts, enough to force the pilot to jink, not necessarily enough to kill him yet. The idea is the same as before. If he can keep the attack from ever becoming a steady, well-timed run, he has already changed the outcome. The lead fighter tries to hold his approach together. He sees traces early. That is wrong. American tail gunners, in his training, are supposed to wait. He adjusts too late. Donovan's fire finds him at 800 yards. The canopy shatters. Flame blooms. The BF-109 rolls inverted and falls. In the few seconds it takes for that plane to die, the rest of the group loses its center. The remaining fighters wobble as their reference disappears. Donovan immediately shifts to the new lead. He has no time to recalibrate or think about anything, but where that next enemy will be in 2 seconds, not where he sits now. His next burst meets the German precisely where geometry says he must fly through. Another BF-109 disintegrates. 3 fighters down in 30 seconds. 9 left. They break off. Not to reposition for another textbook attack, but in full retreat. They did not expect the tail of one bomber to erase a quarter of their number in a single pass. That is the first engagement. A reasonable person might expect it to be the last big one. It is not. The air war over Germany rarely offers simple wins. 15 minutes later, another call comes. This time, it is worse. 18 fighters forming up at 6 o'clock, a full staffel. They have presumably received some information about what happened to the first group. They do not approach in one neat wedge. They spread across multiple vectors. 6 o'clock direct, 7 o'clock, 5 o'clock, maybe 4. The idea is to saturate rear defenses, to give no single gunner time to focus. Again, standard doctrine would say, spread your fire. Try to put something in front of every threat. Hope that combined fire from all positions creates a rough shield. Donovan makes a different choice. He ignores the 4 and 5 o'clock attackers completely. He tells the waist and ball gunners to own them. He focuses everything he has on the 6 o'clock group, because that is the straightest, most physics-efficient path to his airplane. 6 BF-109s bore in directly astern. Closing speed about 400 knots. At 1,200 yards, he opens fire. Not gentle bursts this time, a sustained stream as the fighters drive into his cone. He walks traces into the first German's flight path. The pilot has a terrible choice. Hold course and risk flying into a solid wall of lead, or brake and abandon the run. The pilot holds. At 800 yards, Donovan's rounds hit. They shred canopy and engine. The fighter flips and falls. At 400 yards, he is already on the next man. There is no time for careful corrections, only for trusting his understanding of where a diving aircraft must be in a given number of seconds at that closing speed. He fires where the Messerschmitt will be, not where it still appears. The second fighter dies almost the same way. The remaining 4 break off, not because they lack courage, but because the path ahead of them has turned from an abstract line on a training board into a visible death zone. By the time that second engagement ends, Donovan has used 1,200 rounds in total. He has 800 left. Hell's Fury is still intact. The rest of the formation has taken damage, but nothing like what the briefers had forecast. For a brief stretch, the sky empties. The bombers push on. Everyone breathes. It does not last. The fighters that survived fall back and begin to shadow the formation, just outside effective gun range. Whitmore recognizes what that means. They are calling in more. 10 minutes later, The picture changes from bad to absurd. Radar reports 36 additional fighters, FW-190 and BF-109, combined with the 12 already shadowing. That is 48 fighters converging on the portion of the sky that contains Hell's Fury. Normally, in that situation, a bomber would seek safety in numbers, tighten formation, overlap arcs of fire, let escort fighters handle some of the load. But earlier evasive maneuvers have cost Hell's Fury her slot. The nearest friendly bomber is 3 miles away. No escorts are close enough to engage yet. Donovan checks his ammunition. 380 rounds left. That is less than 20 seconds of continuous fire. Spread across 48 enemy fighters, mathematics alone says it is not enough, unless he changes the equation. He calls the pilot. Captain, permission to engage them while they form up. Not wait for the attack. Hit them in the organization phase. Whitmore asks the obvious question. What happens when you are dry and we still have half the mission left? Donovan answers with the only logic he has left. If they reach full coordination, we do not have half a mission left. We have seconds. Whitmore thinks for 3 seconds. Then he commits. Do it. If this gets us killed, I will complain to your ghost. The German fighters begin to pull into their attack waves. To them, it must look like a favorable picture. Bombers spread out, one straggling slightly. No visible escort. They have numerical superiority and textbook doctrine on their side. They also have a blind spot, the doctrine that teaches them to form up carefully for maximum effect does not expect a single tail gunner to treat that formation as his primary target. It assumes gunners will wait politely until individual fighters step forward. Donovan does not wait. At 2,000 yards, he begins a maximum sustained barrage into the center of the fighter stream. This is not aimed at one plane. It is aimed at the volume of air where spacing and timing are being established. For 8 seconds, he pours 200 rounds into that space. In that brief time, 3 things happen. One German fighter takes a direct hit, catches fire, and falls. 2 others, trying to jink away from the traces while remaining in position, misjudge and collide. The perfect flowing pattern of the impending attack breaks apart into terrified individual reactions. Instead of a synchronized strike by 48 aircraft, Hell's Fury now faces dozens of separate pilots, suddenly preoccupied with not hitting each other. The bomber crew watches this in disbelief. So does Whitmore. He does not need an advanced degree in tactics to understand what just happened. A one-man gun position has fractured the largest assault he has ever seen into chaos before a single cannon round has been fired at them. It is not a victory. It is a delay. Donovan knows the Germans will regroup. They do it faster than he hoped. 90 seconds later, 12 fighters peel off from the mess and drive straight in from 6 o'clock. No elegant formation now, no textbook, just a rage-fueled swarm. He has 180 rounds left. He cannot kill them all. He does not need to. He needs to make continuing the attack look more expensive than breaking off. He picks his targets carefully, not the ones on the edges, not even the one closest. He aims at the center of the swarm, the place where, if courage lives anywhere, it lives there. He puts 30-round bursts into 3 consecutive aircraft in that cluster. 1 explodes outright. 2 trail smoke and peel away. The 9 that remain keep coming. 400 yards, 300, 20-millimeter rounds from their cannons streak past the tail. Some hit. Metal shrieks. The bomber shudders. Donovan stays on the triggers until his last belt runs empty. He drops 2 more fighters in those final seconds. Then the hammer goes down on empty chambers. He reports what everyone in the tail already knows. He is out. There is no ammunition left. The bomber still flies. The control damage is serious but manageable. No one is bleeding to death. The cockpit can still steer. The remaining German fighters know they have hurt Hell's Fury, but they also know how many of their own have fallen to this one tail. They regroup one more time, 27 aircraft from the original 48. They swing wide and come in low astern at 6 o'clock. That is the one vector Donovan can no longer cover with bullets. On paper, this is the moment when the probabilities finally run out. He still has one tool that is not in any ammunition count. He keeps the guns moving as if they are live. He tracks the lead fighter perfectly. No wavering, no lazy movements. From the German cockpit, all the pilot sees is twin barrels locked onto his nose. He has heard about this bomber by now, the one with the tail gunner who fires sooner and hits harder than anyone else. Instinct overrides reason. The German breaks formation with a hard right turn, even though he knows, intellectually, that the guns have been firing for minutes and must be running low. His wingmen follow his movement. In a second, the execution-style run dissolves. They have no appetite left for more losses against this particular target. They peel away and do not reform for another pass. The rest of the mission still lies ahead. Augsburg, bomb release, more fighters, more flak. But none of the subsequent attacks focus on Hell's Fury. On radio nets, the Germans warn each other about one bomber with an insane tail. If you have other targets, they tell each other, take them instead. Back on the ground, after 9 hours in the air, the crew chief counts damage on Hell's Fury. 47 bullet holes, 13 cannon strikes, a destroyed hydraulic line, cracked rudder structure. The airplane is hurt, but alive. The men are shaken, but standing. The ammo cans in the tail are empty. Every round has been fired. The numbers for the engagement are stark. 2,000 rounds used, 12 fighters confirmed destroyed, several more heavily damaged or listed as probable losses. More important than that, dozens of attack runs that never fully happened because a single gunner moved the firing line back from ideal range into formation phase. What Donovan has done in those 4 minutes is not magic. It is just a ruthless extension of the logic he worked out on scraps of paper, applied under pressure. If you can force the other side to respond to you instead of the other way around, you can use even limited resources to bend the shape of the fight. By the time Hell's Fury's wheels hit the runway back in England, the story had already outrun the airplane. Word moved faster than official reports. Crews from other squadrons watched the battered B-17 roll to a stop, with the tail almost stitched to pieces and still attached. Ground crew swarmed the fuselage, counting holes with the same grim curiosity as men checking lottery tickets. They had seen bombers come back. They had seen wrecks land on 2 engines and half a wing. What they had not seen before was a crew chief open the tail ammo boxes and find nothing left. 2,000 rounds loaded, 2,000 rounds fired. Sergeant Murphy, the crew chief, had his own checklist: structural damage, systems damage, human damage. He walked around the airplane slowly, hand on the skin, eyes picking out the fresh scars. He traced the shattered hydraulic line with his fingers, noted the cracked rudder fittings, logged the near misses where cannon rounds had passed through thin air inches from vital control runs. When he got to the tail, he saw Donovan sitting on the tarmac with his back against the wheel, helmet off, smoking a cigarette. "You used everything," Murphy said. "Had to," Donovan answered. "Did not have enough to waste any." That answer did not fit the usual categories. In most debriefs, gunners either apologized for firing too much or were scolded for firing too little. Here was a man who had expended every bullet and treated it like a calculation, not a brag. Captain Whitmore had his own numbers to look at. 12 confirmed kills from the tail alone. more tagged as probable by other crews and the escort fighters that finally caught up near the target. No men killed on his ship. Severe damage, yes, but control remained. Engines remained. The mission had reached Augsburg, dropped bombs, and come home. In the immediate debrief, the intelligence officer asked Donovan the standard questions. How many fighters did you engage? From which directions? At what ranges did you open fire? What did you observe about enemy tactics? Donovan described the engagements in the same unemotional, specific terms he had used on his scraps of paper. He did not say, "I just kept shooting." He said, "I began firing into their forming pattern at approximately 2,000 yards because their paths were most predictable there." He explained why he had ignored the fighters at 4 and 5 o'clock. He explained why he had targeted the second or third attacker in a group instead of the one closest. The intelligence officer wrote it all down. His job was to collect data, not judge it. The people who did judge it sat further up the chain. At 8th Air Force Headquarters, the initial reaction to the mission summary was mixed. On one hand, a single bomber should not, in theory, be able to claim a dozen fighters. On the other hand, German records intercepted over radio traffic and later cross-checked with other formations suggested that the kill count was at least plausible. Multiple groups had seen fighters breaking off from the vicinity of Hell's Fury, trailing smoke or fire. The part that bothered some senior officers was not the success. It was the method. Current training materials emphasized disciplined, conservative, defensive fire. They warned explicitly against long-range shooting. They specifically cautioned gunners not to be drawn into duels with fighters at the expense of their ammunition load. Donovan had violated all of those lines, yet his airplane had come back from one of the worst missions of the war intact, while others that followed the book had not. Someone had to decide whether what he did was a dangerous fluke or something the system should deliberately copy. That someone turned out to be Major General Frederick Anderson, one of the men responsible for how the 8th Air Force fought. When he arrived at Framlingham the next day, there were no cameras, no ceremony. He walked past the parked bombers, looked at the repair crews welding patches over new holes, and asked to see the tail gunner from Hell's Fury. He found Donovan in the enlisted barracks, not celebrating, not holding court, but cleaning his guns. The bomber had gone to a different aircraft for the next mission. The guns, so long as they were not physically bent, went with him. He treated them with the same care he had the week before. Strip, inspect, oil, reassemble. The general introduced himself and told Donovan to be at ease. Then he asked one question that mattered more than all the tactical detail reports. Did you plan to do exactly what you did, or did you just react? Donovan answered without hesitation. He had thought about it before they crossed the channel. He had run the numbers. He had decided that if the fighters massed the way intelligence said they would, the only chance to affect the outcome with his limited ammunition was to hit them while they were still building the attack, not after. Anderson listened to the rest. The early fire at 2,000 yards, the focus on formation centers, the decision to let other gunners handle side threats instead of swinging his own field of fire back and forth, the use of the last few rounds to hit the psychological core of the swarm, not just the nearest aircraft. When Donovan was finished, the general did not praise him. He asked something harder. Can this be taught? Donovan thought for a moment. Some of it, he said. The geometry, the timing, the understanding of when to sacrifice ammo today to save crews across a mission. But not every gunner would be able to sit still while fighters appeared in their untouched sectors. Not every gunner would be willing to accept the risk of being the first to fire and the last to go quiet. The general put it in broader terms. We can either pretend this did not happen and keep losing bombers under a doctrine that assumes the enemy always chooses when the shooting starts. Or we can accept that our manuals are behind reality and adjust. If we do the second, I need someone who can take what is in his head and put it into other men's hands. Donovan had expected to fly again with his crew. He liked them. He trusted Whitmore's instincts. He had imagined that the way to save more bombers was to keep doing what he had done, mission after mission. Instead, Anderson told him flatly that his crew no longer needed him as much as other crews did. 9 lives versus thousands. The arithmetic was brutal. The logic was clear. Effective immediately, Donovan was reassigned from combat crew to training command. Among enlisted men, that kind of move could feel like exile. Some of his peers saw flying as the only real contribution. Teaching could look like a step down. Donovan did not argue. He saw the same math the general saw. If his way of fighting could be broken down into principles that other gunners could understand and use, then the short-term loss of one aggressive tail on one bomber might pay off in a very long-term way. He began by writing down the core ideas that had driven his 4 minutes over Augsburg, stripped of bravado. He summarized them into principles that did not sound like slogans, but like rules. Do not wait for the attacker to dictate the range. Engage during the approach phase, when formation is tight and pilots are predicting, not reacting. Do not spread your attention across every threat when heavily outnumbered. Choose the most dangerous sector and make it so costly that the enemy abandons that vector. Use ammunition to shape the enemy's confidence, not just to destroy his hardware. A formation that is intimidated and hesitant does less damage than one that is precise and fearless, even if you never score a kill. Accept that individual risk may go up when you fire first. Accept that mission risk may go down if enough gunners do the same. These ideas, eventually, would be labeled with phrases like seize initiative, psychological fire, focus fire, and ammunition economy through aggression. At the moment, they were simply the logical result of fighting in a way the manuals had not anticipated. When the first groups of tail gunners arrived for what became his course, they were not blank slates. They had already flown missions under the old doctrine. Some had been wounded. Some had watched their friends not return. All of them had internalized the fear of waste drilled into them in initial training. Donovan did not start by calling them cowards or telling them they had been wrong. He started the way his own thinking had started, with the numbers. 38% casualty rate in tail positions under the current system. 52% of German attack runs completed as planned. Average bomber losses per 1,000 sorties with conservative fire. Then he showed them the figures from missions where gunners had fired early and aggressively, including his own. Lower completion rates for enemy attacks. Lower bomber loss rates. He did not claim that shooting first made anyone invincible. He did show that, across enough missions, it bent the percentages. Then, he took them to the range and made them do something their first instructors would have hated. Fire at targets at the edge of effective range. Fire at moving patterns instead of single silhouettes. Practice tracking and shooting into the space between aircraft, not just at a single painted dot. Some of the men adapted quickly. They had the same mental baseline he did. They saw opportunity in disruption. Others struggled. The hardest part was not learning to fire early. It was learning to leave some threats for others. Tail gunners had been taught that everything behind the bomber was their personal responsibility. Giving up part of that area to focus on one slice felt like neglect. Those who could not make that shift washed out of the program. It was not a judgment on their courage. It was an acknowledgement that the psychology required for this style of fighting was not universal. A man who could not ignore a fighter at 4:00 to preserve fire for the center swarm might still be a perfectly competent defensive gunner. He just would not become one of Donovan's specialists. On the other side of the front, without knowing his name, German officers noticed that something had changed. After years of seeing American bombers behave in a largely predictable way, they started encountering formations where tail guns opened up at longer ranges, where attacks that had worked in 1943 suddenly broke apart under unexpected fire. In their own debriefs, German pilots complained of undisciplined American gunnery. They meant it as criticism. Their analysts eventually had to admit that undisciplined, in this context, also meant more dangerous to us than before. In a matter of months, the habits of a single man and a single tail had begun to pressure a doctrine that had seemed fixed on both sides. On the American side, written manuals started to include language about aggressive engagement and psychological disruption. On the German side, internal memos began to recommend avoiding direct stern attacks on bombers that showed signs of that aggression. Doctrine, once a set of orders printed in handbooks, was being pulled apart and rewoven in real time by what had happened in 4 minutes over Augsburg and by the decision not to ignore it. By the summer of 1944, most of the men flying in the 8th Air Force had never heard the name Donovan. They did not need to. What they knew was that briefings sounded different now. The slides about expected fighter opposition had not changed much. The numbers of BF-109s and FW-190s still looked ugly. But the part about how to meet them had shifted. Where instructors used to say wait until 800 yards and conserve ammunition, they now said, if you see them forming, make them pay for it early. They told tail gunners to be the first to speak and the last to fall silent. They warned that ammunition was not just metal, it was leverage. Spend it where it changes the enemy's plan, not just where it makes good holes in a silhouette. The statistics behind those changes did not fit into a heroic montage. They came in dense tables, compiled in operations rooms far from the cold air at 20,000 feet. Analysts compared missions from March to missions from June. Same routes, same targets, same German fighter units opposing them. One pattern stood out. On missions where gunners opened fire aggressively during the approach phase, German fighters completed barely a quarter of their planned attack runs. On missions where gunners held to the old discipline, more than half of the attacks went through as briefed. Bomber loss rates told the same story in a language even a tired crew chief could understand. Early in 1944, an average of 14 bombers were lost per 1,000 sorties. By late summer, the number was closer to 8. Several factors contributed: better escort coverage, improved formations, damage to German fuel supplies. But when staff officers broke down the causes, a significant chunk of the improvement traced back to one simple behavior change. Tail gunners stopped waiting and started interfering with the enemy's timing. Those numbers never appeared on a nose art panel. They did not make loud stories in bars. They did, however, show up every time a squadron counted heads after a rough mission and found more men present than they would have expected a year before. On the German side, the shift was just as visible, only in reverse. Fighter pilots who had once welcomed the sight of a bomber stream as an opportunity started regarding certain formations as problems to be avoided. Radio traffic recorded over the summer carried fragments of frustration. Reports of heavier than expected fire from rear positions and American gunners opening at long range in formation phase. Luftwaffe trainers tried to adapt. Internal notes recommended avoiding direct stern attacks on bombers that showed early aggressive fire. They suggested high-angle dives from 11 or 1 o'clock, where tail guns could not bear as effectively. In practice, those new tactics required more training, more fuel, and more risk. Germany in 1944 was short on all three. For individual German pilots, the change felt personal. Instead of one predictable burst of traces timed to the last seconds of the approach, They now saw streams reaching for them whenever they tried to line up. They had to watch their spacing and the chaos created by even a single bomber that treated their formation as a target instead of a fate. When the first man in a staffel flinched under that kind of fire, others followed. Confidence eroded attack by attack. Back in training command, Donovan saw none of the German reports and only pieces of the Allied ones. His world had shrunk to classrooms, firing ranges, and the small groups of gunners who cycled through his course. He did not stand at a podium and promise them invincibility. He walked them through the same ugly numbers that had convinced him to change his own habits. 38% casualty rate for tail gunners under the old doctrine, 23% after the new one took hold. He did not claim credit for the entire drop. He did say, without apology, that the way they chose to use their guns was part of the difference between those two lines on the chart. The men he trained went back to their squadrons carrying more than techniques. They carried a different mental default. When they saw fighters massing at 6 o'clock, they no longer thought we must endure this. They thought we have a window to break this before it hardens. On the best days, that meant German waves that never fully formed. On the worst days, it meant they died firing first instead of dying waiting. Either way, they left fewer clean runs for the enemy. Over time, their results accumulated. When the war ended and staff officers assembled final reports, a pattern emerged. Graduates of Donovan's aggressive course made up a minority of the total gunners in theater, but accounted for a disproportionate share of confirmed fighter kills from rear positions. More importantly, in units where at least one or two of those men flew regularly, overall bomber loss rates were lower than in comparable groups without them. Fear, apparently, could be contagious in both directions. After the war, the air forces that survived had time to think about what they had learned. Historians and tacticians in multiple countries looked at the same set of facts and drew similar conclusions. The lesson was not simply that one man and one tail had remarkable reflexes. It was that defense, when it waited for the attacker to define the fight, bled more than defense that turned as much as possible into offense. Manuals written in the late 1940s and 1950s for bombers, fighters, and even ground-based air defense reflected that shift. They talked about early engagement. They stressed disrupting enemy coordination in its forming stage. They treated the enemy's confidence as a legitimate target. In some sections, they even mentioned tail gunners by name, not as passive crew members, but as active shapers of the engagement. None of that appeared in Donovan's life story. He went back to South Boston when his service ended. He took a job in construction. He married. He raised children. When local reporters occasionally tried to get him to talk, he brushed off their questions. He said he had done what needed doing and that 300 other gunners had done the same. He did not list his kills. He did not keep a scrapbook of doctrine changes. His obituary, decades later, was short. It mentioned his wartime service as a tail gunner. It mentioned that he had been involved in developing new tactics. It did not mention 12 fighters destroyed in minutes, 300 trainees, or the thousands of men who never had to find out what it felt like to burn over Germany because enemy pilots chose not to press home an attack. The people who understood the difference gathered without cameras. Old gunners who had gone through his course. Pilots who had watched impossible attack waves fall apart and only later heard who had taught their crews to shoot that way. They raised glasses and talked not about glory, but about small, specific moments. The first time they had pulled the triggers at a formation instead of at a single aircraft. The first time they had watched a disciplined enemy group wobble and scatter under fire that, by old rules, they should never have fired. In their stories, survival did not look like hiding behind armor or praying for escort fighters. It looked like making the other man think twice, like firing before his plan could solidify, like accepting that safety in a sky full of enemies was not something you received. It was something you created, second by second, round by round. The official histories would later sum it up in tidy phrases: aggressive defense, initiative in rear positions, psychological disruption. For the men who had been there, it was simpler. Someone had finally stopped waiting to be hunted. If you like mature stories about decision costs and doctrine over hero worship, hit like, comment, subscribe. Helps me know to keep this tone going.